I had one actor who could not say birthday. He would say birthday. And you don't want to call somebody out and, make them feel stupid or whatever. But I was like, okay, can we try birthday again? And he go, yeah, okay. So we were talking, and it happened to be my birthday. And I'm like, what the fuck is wrong?
I'm Jake Jacobs, and you're listening to What the Fuck? My special guest today, Robb, was the head of the audio department at the Art Institute in Nashville. And I met Robb not as a 18-year-old, 19-year-old student, but as a 45-year-old man going back to school for the first time in a long time. Robb was very influential on my career in the audio industry. Not in a way that you might think, though, because the one class that Robb taught that I was able to attend dealing with dialogue and editing dialogue and cleaning it up. I learned a lot from that. And a couple years after I graduated, after not really making it with the music stuff, now I'm doing podcasts and I'm editing audio the way Robb taught me how to do it. So
that's awesome.
A big what the fuck welcome to my friend and mentor, Robb. How the hell are you, sir?
I'm awesome, Jake. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome.
And thank you for those nice words, because to be honest, it was a class about audio post-production, which involved sound for film and commercials and then audiobooks, too. Because a lot of people didn't realize that that's actually a career.
Yes.
Editing audiobooks. And then podcasting wasn't really a big thing at that point.
Nah.
But the whole technique of editing dialogue, making sure the dialogue is clear, pacing it the right way, all that stuff, that all applies across the board to all the post-production work. I used to get a lot of really amazing what the fuck blank stares in my class, because a lot of the students were like, I don't care about this. I want to make some beats and whatever.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how gratifying it is to hear you say that you got something out of the class like that, because as a teacher, you try and do a good job and reach people, and you're not going to get to most people, but I think it was because you were older and you actually had a little bit more of an open mind than some of the younger students.
Yeah.
And more life experience. You were one of the few people that you could tell the light kind of went on in your head a little bit. It's like, yeah, I'll pay attention to this. Maybe this might be helpful sometime.
I wasn't sitting there on my phone playing Farmville on Facebook.
Yeah, exactly.
It was an interesting time. The 3 years that I was there, learned a lot. I want to go back a little further, because before the Art Institute, you did some really cool stuff. And one of the things I wanted to touch on was your involvement with Warner Brothers and archiving some of the iconic audio from the Bugs Bunny era and that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
What can you tell us?
Well, I was living in Los Angeles. A friend of mine had called and said, hey, I have this friend in Chicago who's moving to LA. He's a new film composer, and he just got a gig recreating some of the cartoons from like Daffy Duck, some of the older Daffy Duck cartoons and stuff. And he needs somebody to come over and set up his studio. Would you be able to go and do that? I had a lot of experience with synchronization, and at the time we were using video machines, and at the beginning of starting to use computers for sequencing and that kind of thing, and analog tape machines. So I was really good at synchronizing all those things together. So, they all were running at the right time and blah, 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 blah. So I got him set up, got his whole studio rigged up, and he goes, hey, have you ever done sound effects for cartoons before? And this was a what the fuck moment. I paused a second and I said, oh yeah, sure. I had a complete lie. I had watched Warner Brothers cartoons since I was a little kid, and I loved them, especially Roadrunner stuff and everything.
Oh, yeah.
And he goes, oh, well, cool. Well, I'm supposed to recreate the music, but we also need to recreate the sound effects for all this. And I was like, oh, cool.
Okay, yeah.
And so he goes, when can you start? Can you start next week? And I'm like, yeah, sure. So I went home over the weekend and sweated, and I dragged out all my VHS tapes of Warner Brothers cartoons and just started watching everything and really, really paying attention to the sound effects and the whoop and the and all that kind of stuff. I understood the recording process. I understood how to record stuff, but the challenge was to try and get these sound effects to sound like the original ones.
Yeah.
And they were recorded in a certain way in a certain space where it was hard to recreate that That just even the sound of the room, like the reverb tail you hear on certain things.
Yeah.
Was hard to recreate that kind of thing. So we started working on it, and I'm kind of stumbling through trying to get some stuff, and there was just a few things I couldn't get together. They had arranged to meet with one of the guys who had been doing sound effects for Warner Brothers for like 30 years or whatever. He wasn't the original person. The original person that did a lot of that was a guy by the name of Treg Brown, who is credited as an editor, but he did the majority of all the sound effects and stuff and created all that. But this other guy, Frank, had been there working, and he kind of took over from Treg initially and had built this huge library, and all the sounds were on film mag stock.
Okay.
Right? Like thick film
Yeah.
that you have to put through either a projector or through a flatbed, which is what you edit film on.
Mm-hmm.
And so they brought me over, and they show me this little closet on the Warner Brothers lot and said, here are all the sound effects that Frank has curated over the past whatever years. And it's all these little reels of film, all kind of loosely cataloged, kind of like here's some whoops, here's a boings, here's a flip flop, here's a zippity out and zippity in, all these things, I'm like, cool, because now I understand the vocabulary here. I know because the names of the things sounded like the sound, what is it? Automatopoeia, right?
Mm-hmm.
They said, well, what we want you to do is we'd like you to listen to these, obviously, but we want you to transfer all this stuff to digital tape. At the time was a DAT tape.
DAT, yeah.
And they said, you can come in every day for however long you need, and you'll be in this little room. So I was locked in this tiny little room, not locked, but stuck in this little room, and transferred all of these different takes and different versions of sound effects onto digital tape. At the time, we didn't really have a lot of noise reduction stuff, so it still had that gritty sound a bit to it.
Yeah.
Some distortion in it, some noise from the film stock. But I was able to just get everything digitally transferred, and then we were going to figure out how we could clean that stuff up after that. So that took me, I think I did that for 3 weeks. It was like 7 or 8 hours a day. The last day I was there was the day that the riots broke out in Los Angeles after Rodney King. So that gives you an idea how long ago that was.
Yeah.
I was about to leave, and they said, well, you know what? We're going to close up the studio for the rest of the week. So,
yeah. And
that was the last time I was there. But anyway, I got all that stuff transferred. Eventually, it ended up going to a sound effects library called, I think it was Sound Ideas. They make sound effects libraries that you can buy. Mm-hmm. And they took all that stuff and cleaned up some of it and just cataloged it and whatever and released them. But there are a lot of sound effects that Warner Brothers wouldn't let them have that were real iconic sounds, like the Roadrunners, meep, meep, that sound.
Yeah.
They said, nope, that doesn't go anywhere. The carrot crunch from Bugs Bunny.
Wow.
That doesn't go anywhere. And there's a couple other sounds like that. And they said the only person that's going to be allowed to use these is you and any of our other editors. And you can only use this on Warner Brothers sanctioned or whatever projects.
Right.
They made me sign a contract and all this stuff.
Wow.
So I was walking, I had at home in my studio, I had all these tapes of all this stuff. I'm like, whoa. But I couldn't do anything with it unless they called up and said, hey, we need you to do some sound for a commercial or whatever. That was pretty weird. And that was an amazing learning experience because I got to hear not only just the sound effect, but what they would do to prep before it and after it. So
that's cool.
Where you could hear where they would move a mic around a little bit to adjust what they were doing. And you could hear how the room would change and the reverb of the room would change. That's how I got my start doing all this stuff. And I eventually went on to work with Chuck Jones, who was the original Warner Brothers animation directors, who did Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny and Foghorn Leghorn. And so I got to work on a bunch of projects for him for like 10 years until he passed away.
Was Mel Blanc already gone by then? You ever get a chance?
Mel Blanc passed away the month after I started working for this composer guy. And what was weird is that his son, Noel, was starting to try and take over for him. And he had most of the voices nailed, but the big complaint about him was that he didn't have the acting down that Mel had. Because Mel could just rip back and forth between different characters and just get into that character or whatever.
Yeah.
Where anyone else trying to replace him kind of struggled with it. And they finally, I worked on a couple things that Noel had done some voices for. And then they started using a couple other people. Joe Alasky was another person who started doing Bugs Bunny's voices. But yeah, it was interesting. I never got a chance to work with Mel Blanc, though. That would have been cool because he was just, you go back and watch some of the interviews and stuff with him, and it's pretty amazing. You know the sound of when the coyote falls off a cliff and you hear that whistle?
Yeah.
That whistle is actually, he recorded I don't know if it was a bomber, some sort of a bomber.
Okay.
And that's the sound. And he had that whole, you could hear the plane fly over, and then you hear the... And so parts of it, you're like, what the heck is that? And then you realize as it gets closer that that's the sound that he used for him falling off the cliff.
Like, wait a minute.
And it was just the way he edited it, and made it fit. It was cool.
Rob is the person that introduced me to the Wilhelm scream.
Now, people probably don't know what the heck that is, but it is on 2 commercials right now.
You probably know a little bit more about the origin. I only know the lore. Like, the only thing that I know is they were trying to figure out for sure who voiced it. And the last I heard, it was, I can't remember his name, but he was from Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs, the singer. Yeah. Am I correct in that?
I believe so.
The Wilhelm scream.
It started out, and I always use this as an example in class, where if one person has a sound effect and they use it, and then another person gets that same sound effect and they use it, and then that person and that another person, you start hearing the same door close over and over again. You start hearing the same car start over and over again. There it is in its glory. So the deal was that I think the first time it was used was in a Western. I don't know the name of the Western. If you go on Wikipedia, there's a whole thing about
history, yes.
The history of it, where this guy on the horse gets shot, and they wanted to put some sort of a sound of him falling off his horse and dying. And so they found this scream and put it in. And then that ended up starting to populate. I mean, it started going on everything where anyone was flying away or got blown up and they flew away or got shot. And you start hearing it all over the place. And it became the de facto I'm dying scream.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So years passed, and eventually people kind of got away from it because they're like, yeah, okay, we've heard that. We can make different stuff now, blah, blah, blah. As obviously as the recording process and technology moved ahead. But a number of sound editors, and I think it kind of started with people at Skywalker Sound when they were working on Raiders of the Lost Ark and Star Wars. They started putting that scream in various places where you may not necessarily hear it or notice it, but it was put in as a joke.
Yeah.
That kind of caught on, and every audio engineer doing anything was starting to put it in everywhere. And it's still, to this day, it shows up in movies. It shows up in movie trailers, commercials. I think most people don't have a clue what the hell they've heard it before, and they think, oh, that's silly, but they really don't know where it came from.
We would have projects that we would have to do. Sometimes it would be a musical project. Sometimes it would be like a podcast type of thing. It was my mission, and I did it. And I was successful at it.
I remember.
I put in the Wilhelm scream on every single project.
Yep.
And sometimes it was super subtle. You'd really have to listen for it. Other times I just put it in your face.
Oh, yeah.
But anytime I did that, I would let Rob hear it. And Rob's like, okay, where's the Wilhelm scream? I know it's in there somewhere.
I remember that very well. Sometimes audio editing and doing sound for certain things can get kind of tedious.
Oh, yeah.
How many times do I have to hear somebody get punched? Sometimes you just got to stick something in there that people may not notice, but it's there.
Oh, yeah.
And it just kind of makes you smile a little bit every time you hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Pretty fun.
Something else I wanted to talk to you about. Rob, you are a very talented drummer. And I knew that.
Used to be.
Talented enough to where you actually went on tour with Bobby Goldsboro for a little bit.
Yes, I did for almost 10 years. Yeah.
That was after the Art Institute, correct?
It was during. We usually went out over the weekends. Older artists will tend to do that, especially if they're getting up in age. And that was cool because, I could leave on a Friday. We'd do a show maybe Friday night or do a show Saturday and then get home by Sunday. And so when I was still teaching at the Art Institute, I was able to leave and go and do that kind of thing. We did a number of shows in Vegas and Laughlin and Reno, and, all of those hot spots. Plus, then we would hit the Florida circuit and
wow,
all over the place. Yeah, it was fun. I got the gig from a mutual friend of mine, Michael Stanton, who's pedal steel guitar player, but he's also a keyboard player. He had worked for Bobby for 40 years. He originally helped Bobby score the show Evening Shade with Burt Reynolds. Mm-hmm. Remember that?
Yeah, I remember that.
Bobby did all the music for that. And so Michael worked with him on that and a whole bunch of other stuff. When their original drummer decided to retire, they asked if I would be interested. And I said, yeah, It was the kind of gig where I was like, I can still play, but I don't have to deal with sitting on a bus, I don't have to do all that kind of thing.
Right.
What was nice is I always used backline gear, meaning that I didn't have to cart my drums around with me.
Nice.
So I was able to use, they always were able to rent good equipment for that. And so that was cool. It was kind of a low stress gig and it was fun. It was an older audience. Mm-hmm. Here's a good what the fuck. We were playing in the Villages in Florida, which is a huge retirement community. They have their own theater, and they would bring in Bobby and other groups like Tommy James and Hermits and all of the nostalgia kind of things. And so we came in to do a show there. We're driving into the main entrance, and I see like 6 ambulances in the front of the building in the parking lot.
Okay.
I'm like, what the hell's going on? What's going on here? So we go into the stage door and I see the stage manager. I go, hey man, what's the deal with all the ambulances out front? And he goes, oh, don't worry. It's just there for emergencies. He goes, you do understand this is a really old crowd, right? And I'm like, yeah, but what?
What the fuck?
You mean these people are going to be dropping dead? What's going on here?
Oh, my God.
What kind of audience is this?
Wow.
There were times where we'd have to hold the show for 10 minutes because they were still bringing people in wheelchairs and walkers and like, okay. I get that's cool. Whatever. Yeah. Still a good crowd. They enjoyed hearing Bobby, and it was fun.
Like, Rob, no Ronnie Tut style stuff on the drums tonight. We don't need anybody having a heart attack.
Yeah, basically,
so just,
Cool.
Yeah.
Rob, let's cut that drum solo.
Yeah.
The front row is full of 80 plus, and I don't think it's going to go over well.
One of the things I noticed when I first moved to Nashville was the amount of celebrities that lived in this area that you would accidentally bump into, like at the grocery store or Starbucks. Coming from LA, was it a little bit different? Or
when I first moved to Nashville, people were like, and I moved here in 1995 from Los Angeles, so I had this jaded LA view of anybody that you see famous, stay away from them. They're gonna be assholes to you or whatever. Yeah. And when we got here, I have a number of what the fuck moments I can talk about of people I've met here just by accident. Most of the people that live around us here in Nashville that are famous, there's no problem them going out and being normal folks like they really are. And a lot of them are happy to talk to people and just say, if you go up and say, I'm a huge fan. Now, if you act like a complete asshole or you're losing your mind.
Yeah.
In fact, here's a great story. I was in Walgreens up the street from me in the checkout line. Luke Bryant walks in with a friend of his, and this woman dressed in orange and white Tennessee Volunteer outfit walks in, and right in the middle of the store, she goes, oh my God. You're Luke Bryant. I love you. And she's screaming it. And everyone's around there looking around. And he just stops dead cold in his tracks. He's like, oh. And you could look on his face. He was like, oh, shit. But he was cool. He turned around and she ran up and wanted to give him a hug. And it's like, he was really cool about it. And I was, and then he's walking by and I'm like, hey, how's it going? I just I wasn't going to go, oh, my God. You're Luke Bryant. If you're cool, everybody's cool. It's just, that's the way it is.
One of the things that draws people to Nashville is everyone wants to be a songwriter. Apart from doing the sound effects for Warner Brothers and playing drums for Bobby Goldsboro, did you ever get into any of the other sides of the music business?
My first foray into starting my own business when I was still in Los Angeles, a friend of mine and I decided we were going to start we wanted to write music for sports programming and news themes and stuff.
Oh, cool.
I've never been a songwriter. I've never been able to sit down and write a 4-minute song with the lyrics and all that stuff. I could do that. But if I have a picture in front of me or moving image or whatever, for some reason I can write to that.
That's interesting.
It's weird.
Yeah.
And I've tried, I've really tried to sit here and I'm like, I'm going to write a song. And I'm like, no, forget it. This sucks. But I get real focused on trying to do stuff to images and everything. And so we were like, okay, let's try this out. And so he was a keyboard player and good at programming and all that stuff, and I was playing drums and a little bass here and there. And so we wrote a couple of sports kind of themes, like energy, pumped up,
with lyrics or just the music?
Just the music, just kind of to be like intro music or play underneath, when the announcers or whatever. Mm-hmm. A mutual friend said, hey, I got a guy who works for this brand new cable company called the Z Channel in Los Angeles, and they just got the contract to broadcast all the Dodger games. And I think they're looking for music for their opening and for all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, no shit. Okay. So we contacted this guy, and he came over, and we had this tiny little studio in my apartment. With him, we worked on some stuff. He gave us specific, I wanted to build up here for the first 10 seconds, and then we want to cut down there and blah, blah, blah. So he guided us through all that. We recorded a bunch of stuff, gave him big mistake. First dumbass mistake I ever made was gave him a DAT tape with all of our music mixed on it. He walked out and didn't hear from him. Like 2 weeks. He was like, oh yeah, they're going to love this. This is the fact that I'm working on it with you. We're getting it tailored to what I think they want. 2 weeks go by, don't hear back. What's the deal? And it's starting to get closer to opening day for the Dodgers, right? And I would call the guy, finally got a hold of him. He goes, oh, well, you know what happened? They decided they were going to go with something else. And I'm like, oh, well, okay. Thanks. Thanks for giving it a shot with us. That's cool. I hung up the phone. I was just like, okay, well, whatever. We'll try, keep going. That you don't let one door close and keep finding the right door. I'm a baseball fan, so opening day, I decided, okay, I'm going to watch the Dodger game. I'm not a Dodger fan. I'm a Cubs fan, but I'll watch the Dodger game. Sitting there, and guess what comes on?
Oh, my God. I was afraid you were going to say that.
And I said, what the fuck? That's our music they're playing.
That is bullshit.
I got up. I'm running around the apartment. I'm looking for a baseball bat. I'm going to get in my car, and I'm going to find this asshole and beat the shit out of him. And my friend's like, yeah, let's not do that. I think you need to maybe get a lawyer, find out what the deal is. So I called my dad. I was hoping he had a good suggestion for me. He goes, well, only thing I can ask is, did you copyright the music yourself? Even if his name's on it, if your name's still also on it. I said, no, we just gave him the music. And he goes, well, I would suggest calling an attorney and see what the deal is. And I did that. And the attorney said, do you have a way to prove that you did this? You hold the copyright or part of it. And I'm like, well, I have the sequence and stuff, but I don't have the master tape of it. I have a cassette of it. And he was like, the amount of money you'll get out of them is not the same amount that I'm going to be charging you to do this.
Right.
And he goes, I would just chalk this up to, don't do that, you stupid idiot.
A learning experience, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
And so I never heard from that guy ever again. But man, I was just like.
Did they continue to use that fucking music?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But the saving grace is there's even a documentary about this. A year later, I think the owner of this cable company was indicted or whatever for mishandling funds or I don't know, something like that. And the place was shuttered. So I was like, okay, fuck you. Yep. Good luck.
Here's a weather-related what the fuck, and this ties in with the Art Institute while I was attending. The flood of 2010.
Oh, yeah.
I'm trying to think of who the teacher was. It might have been Seth.
Seth, okay.
But we had a project due that day. and I lived in Jolton, so I lived at the top of a mountain. So I wasn't seeing any of this. And I just happened to turn on the news, and I'm watching The next thing I see this house floating down Interstate 40. Like, what the fuck is going on? This is a little bit more serious than I thought it was. And I'm like, Art Institute, they have to cancel, right? So I turn on the radio and everything's fucking canceling. Not hearing anything about the Art Institute. I'm like, what the fuck? I know they don't expect us to try to drive to school. So I reached out to Seth. He didn't even know what was going on. Or he didn't know how serious it was. I'm like, do we have school today? He's like, let me find out. So Seth had to actually go and talk to one of y'all to see what the hell was going on or to see what he could find out. And finally he called me back. He's like, yeah, don't even worry about school today. We're not.
Yeah, because there was that stream that was by the entrance of the school, I think.
Yeah.
And that overflowed. It took out half of the asphalt and stuff down the street a bit.
Yeah.
You couldn't even get in there anyway. So
yeah. Lucky for me, because the project that was due today, mine wasn't done. So I was going to be thing with great news. So, but he never knew that. So
no, you don't know. He doesn't know. He doesn't need to know that. It's a weather-related incident. That was my problem. Yeah.
When you've grown up and you've gone away from home, you always go back and you tell your parents, all the bad shit that you did now that they can't punish you, right? So Rob was the head of the audio department, and every semester we would get like a set number of studio hours that we could go into the studio and use it for projects and whatever. Toward the end there, when it was apparent that I was actually going to graduate and I had all my projects done, I was booking studio time for the Kentucky Linemen, and there were some nights where we were there all fucking night from like 10 o'clock to like 6 o'clock in the morning. And I can't tell you how much Jack Daniels was drinking that fucking control room.
There's a number of projects that occurred in, and I knew some of it was going on, so I was the kind of person who's kind of like, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds really good, guys. Keep going. Because that is part of working in a studio situation with creative people, and that's part of the job. And if you don't know how to handle that, you're going to suck at doing this.
We started loading in, and then somebody walked in with a bottle of Jack, and then somebody else walked in with another bottle of Jack. And I'm like, at some point, so wait, this is a school. Are we allowed to do this? And I'm like, I'm not going to say shit to anybody. We just got to be cool about it.
I don't know.
There was one night where it was an all-nighter at 5 o'clock in the morning. We're all like, and we had the studio until 8, right? So we're all like burnt out by this time. At 5 o'clock in the morning, we're like, let's do a Tammy Wynette cover. And so we're there, and we pull up YouTube, and we're listening to the song, and the song was Till I Can Make It on My Own. It's a ballad.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And we laid down the bass and the drums and the rhythm guitar, and Mitchell, he was tired and his voice was cracking. And obviously he's a male, Tammy Wynette's female, so he wasn't trying to sound like Tammy Wynette.
Right.
But he did this scratch vocal that we were just going to, just the scratch vocal is going to throw away. We'll do the master vocal later, right? So we did that. And then we cleaned the studio. No one ever knew. No one ever said anything to me. Like, hey, you guys fucking trash the place. I was like, no, we left it clean. Drank a lot of Jack, but we left it clean.
Well, that's to me, that was part of the gig. That's part of the, and you would do that if you were working in another studio. You can't trash the place. I mean,
no.
I guess there's some people who probably can get away with it, but most of the time you're in there, and if you're the engineer, you're kind of supposed to be the grown up, so to speak, in the room. And so, it's kind of your deal. You make sure people aren't trashing shit up, and you clean up after everybody's done, and that's the way it is. And I knew certain things, certain people were doing stuff, but I wasn't gonna. That
Rob's like, you're not telling me anything I didn't fucking know, Jay. Come on now.
Yeah. I was not gonna be that guy. I was like, hey, wait a second.
The funny thing is, a couple months later, we actually went back, and Mitchell was trying to do a master vocal for that track.
Yeah.
He listened to that scratch vocal, and he did a couple takes, and I'm in there trying to comp the vocal, and Mitchell's listening to it. And he's like, play that scratch vocal back. And he's like, I don't know what it is. And the scratch vocal, he sang through an SM58. So we didn't even care what microphone it was, because it was just a scratch vocal. Mitchell's like, I cannot get that level of pain in the way that I sang. He said, I can't do it. Like, it was 5 o'clock in the morning. So we ended up using the scratch vocal as the lead vocal for the track.
Well, see,
and then we just kind of built it around that.
Part of your job as the engineer is to capture whatever's happening in the moment.
Yeah.
And if you had not hit record on that scratch vocal, you would have been bummed.
Yeah.
Right?
I've learned real quick since that day, probably. I hit the record button. Even if they ask me, hey, are you recording this? No, don't worry about it.
Absolutely.
No, I record
you
everything.
never let somebody know you're in record. Just make sure you are rolling all the time. time because you never know what's going to come out of somebody's mouth or what some lick someone's going to play or some cool drum fill or.
Oh my God, did you hear about Omni Studios? They fucking tore Omni down.
Yeah, I know. Absolute decimation of Music Row.
I had a critical listening class, or it was an assignment or something, and we had to pick between, there's like 3 songs, and one of the songs was a Vince Gill song, and we had to book the studio time and listen to the song through the control room, through those speakers.
Yeah.
And we had to draw out the sound field and what you're hearing,
Yep.
and it was a really cool project. So I had the studio booked for like 2 hours. A half hour before my studio time was up, this older gentleman comes walking in, and I had no idea who he was, not a clue. So I'm sitting there, and he's like, oh, that's a great Vince Gill song, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking to myself, who the fuck is this guy encroaching on my studio time? Like, I had no idea who he was. And I wasn't being a shithead to him, but I wasn't being as cordial as I could have been had I known who he was. It was Bob Bullock. And he had the studio booked for 8 o'clock. So he was just there a little early, right? So I had no idea. I did my thing and I left and I turned the project in, and I didn't think about it again until a couple semesters later.
Class.
I booked a mixing class and I see this name, Bob Bullock. I'm like, and then I looked him up. I'm like, holy crap, this guy's done some stuff.
Yeah.
Like he's worked on some stuff.
One of the sweetest and nicest people you'll ever meet, too.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I walked into his class and it was at Omni Studios. That's where we had class.
I remember.
I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to fail this class just because. No, he was super cool. And we were in one of his classes and he was telling this story. He was doing this part spoken word, part music project with Waylon Jennings.
Oh.
It was basically Waylon songs and there was talking in between. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it was recorded at Omni, but it was being mixed there. Or Bob was doing something with Waylon at Omni Studios.
Okay.
So Waylon was back in the vocal booth and I think he was doing a spoken dialogue part. Bob kept hearing this crinkling coming through the mic, and he couldn't figure out what it was. So Waylon's just sitting there, and they're trying to figure out, and the engineers are trying to figure out. They're swapping out XLR cables, and they're swapping out mics, and they'd get everything hooked back up and hit record again, and the crinkling is still there. Come to find out, it was Waylon fucking with him. Waylon had a cigarette pack and was fucking with the cellophane, and every time they would get everything straight, all right, let's try it now, Waylon. He would just crinkle that fucking.
That's awesome.
Bob said, I don't know how long that went on until they figured out what it was. Finally, he said, Waylon said, all right, guys, this just me messing with you.
That's awesome. You still are the first person I've ever met that was a fan of Kiss and Waylon Jennings at the same time.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
I was impressed with the spectrum.
We had a studio project, and this wasn't even mine. This was for a classmate, and they had hired Cowboy, Eddie Long, to come in and play pedal steel on it. And I had never met him. Cowboy comes walking in, and I said, Cowboy, when I was 18 years old, my dad took me to see Hank Williams Jr. in Stabler Arena in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And I said, you were the steel player at that time. He's like, yes, I was.
Wow.
He's like, I probably couldn't tell you much about that show. He said, because I was drinking a lot back then. But we became friends. We became still are really good friends. And after I graduated from school, Cowboy called me up one day. He goes, you're done with school, right? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, are you able to do overdubs? Like if I brought my pedal steel to your house, if we had a track for me to play to, could you record me? I'm like, yeah. When he's not on the road, people will hire him to play steel on their records. And I'm usually the one doing it.
That's awesome. That's great.
There's a band called Whiskey Myers. I don't know if you've ever heard of them.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
We did their White album. Mm-hmm. Cowboy called me up and he said, hey, have you heard Whiskey Myers? And I was like, yeah. He goes, we have 8 songs that they want me to do for their record. And he said, it's legit. There's money involved, the whole 9 yards. He said, but can we do it in 2 days? I'm like, you bet your ass we can. And we did.
To hear that you were happy with things and you got information out of it that you still use to this day, that's the biggest compliment that I could ever get, really. Anybody that is involved in teaching like that. So
one of the very first audio classes, John Inglesi was teaching, and this was very early on. We had a huge class where they hadn't started weeding people out yet, right? One of the classmates, in the middle of learning the science behind audio, he asked, when do we see the strippers and cocaine and the parties? And John's like, he didn't say it, but the look on his face like, what the fuck?